On the morning of November 18th, 1918, 7 days after the armistice was signed and the last guns went quiet in France, 4 men vanished from a trapping camp on the Oxbow Channel south of Grosse Tête, Louisiana, and I am the only living person who can tell you where they were when it happened. I know where they were because I left them there. My name is Alcide Broussard. I am 41 years of age, and I am giving this statement to the Iberville Parish Inquest Commission on the 14th of January 1919, under oath and of my own free will. I would ask the commissioners to allow me to speak without interruption, because what I have to say does not improve when told in pieces, and because I have been over it enough times in my own head that I know the order it needs to come in. I know which things need to be said before which other things, and if I get interrupted in the middle, I will have to go back to the beginning. And I do not want to go back to the beginning more times than necessary. I was born in the Atchafalaya Basin, south of Maringouin, in 1877. My father was a trapper and a fisherman before me, and his father before him, and when I was old enough to carry a trap pack, I went into the swamp with my father in the mornings before school, and with him again in the evenings. After, and by the time I was 12, I knew more about mink habitat and muskrat behavior than most men twice my age. When my father died in 1897, I was 20 years old, and I took over his accounts and his lines and his debts, and I have worked the basin in one capacity or another every season since. 30 years, each November through March, with a few summer survey trips in between when the work permitted it. I have set traps in every water system in Iberville and Assumption and St. Martin parishes, and in portions of the eastern Atchafalaya floodway that most trappers do not bother with, because the access is difficult. I have worked the basin in drought years, when you could walk across channels that should have been waist deep, and in flood years, when the whole lower delta was a single sheet of moving water, and in years when the pelt market collapsed, and the season's take barely covered the cost of equipment and provisions. I have never lost a man on a working trip, and I have never left a man behind in the field, not in 30 years, not once. And those 2 facts are the context for everything I am about to say. I am not given to exaggeration. I am not a superstitious man. I am not given to the kind of storytelling that gets larger and more dramatic with each retelling, because I have known men like that, and I have always found them tedious. I have given my account of the events of November 1918 to the deputy at Grosse Tête on the morning of the 18th, to the parish sheriff when he arrived at the camp on the afternoon of the same day, to the coroner's assistant who came out in December to examine the site, and to a man from the state government who visited in January and declined to give me his full name or the name of the office he represented. Each time I have told the same story, with the same facts in the same order, because those are the facts, as they happened, and I have no interest in altering them to make myself appear better or worse than the facts already do. Before I tell you what happened in that camp, I want to tell you about the 4 men who were with me, because I do not want them to be a number in a report. I want the commission to know who they were. Thomas Fontenot, age 38, of Maringouin. Thomas had trapped with me for 6 full seasons, every year since 1912, when he had come to me recommended by a buyer in Baton Rouge, who said he was the most efficient setter he had seen come through the market in several years. I hired him for 1 season on that recommendation and kept him every year after, because the recommendation had been accurate. He was reliable and competent and experienced, and he had better instincts about trap placement than any man I have worked with before or since. He could look at a stretch of channel bank, consider it for maybe 30 seconds, and tell you within a foot or 2 where an animal would choose to cross, and he was right often enough that I had stopped second-guessing his reads and simply followed them. He was not a man who scared easily. He was not a man who invented problems. When Thomas had a concern about something, he said so directly, and once a decision was made, he accepted it and moved on, and did not revisit it. He had a wife in Maringouin named Claire, and 2 sons whose names I know, but will not put in this record, because I cannot bear to write them here. Joseph Arsenault, age 44, of St. Gabriel. Joseph had been working the basin independently since before I inherited my father's accounts, and we had partnered on particular stretches of the line in 4 or 5 seasons before I asked him to come on as a regular crew member in 1915, when I was expanding into a section of the Western Basin that needed more hands than I had. He was the oldest member of our crew by 3 years over me, and he worked accordingly, slowly, methodically, with a precision that sometimes frustrated the younger men, but that produced results you could rely on. His catch rates across 2 seasons as a regular crew member were the best of anyone except Thomas, which was remarkable given the difference in their individual speeds. Joseph also kept the clearest head of any of us when it came to the financial reality of a season, meaning he always knew exactly what the numbers needed to look like, and he was not comfortable with decisions that put those numbers at risk. This was not greed. Joseph had a family in St. Gabriel, and debts from the flood damage in 1916, and the math of a trapping season was not abstract to him. I understood that about him. I understood it, and I took it into account when I was making the decisions I made in that camp, and I took it into account incorrectly. Raymond Duplantis, age 31, of Butte-la-Rose. Raymond was the youngest of the 4, and the man I had known the shortest time, having brought him on at the start of the 1917 season, when a long-time crew member moved to Texas for work in the oil industry. He had been recommended to me by a boat builder in Henderson, who said the young man had been working the basin on his own since he was 17 and knew the water as well as anyone twice his age. I hired him on a trial basis, and he was a permanent member of the crew from the end of that first season. He was quick and capable and adaptable, the kind of worker who makes the people around him more efficient simply by keeping pace well. But the thing that distinguished Raymond from other capable men I have known was what I can only describe as unusually good ears. Not merely sensitive to sound, which you find in men who have worked the outdoors long enough, but good at identifying it, at placing it in space, at distinguishing between sounds that occupy similar registers. He could hear a muskrat push-up being built 200 yards away in a rainstorm. He could tell you at night by the pattern of the wake whether the animal moving through the South Channel was a nutria or a mink. In the field, when something made a sound that none of the rest of us could place, we asked Raymond what he thought it was, and he was almost always right. In retrospect, the fact that Raymond could not identify the sounds he heard in that camp should have told me everything I needed to know. And my brother, Émile Broussard, age 33. Émile had come into the swamp with me since he was 15 years old, first as my apprentice and my responsibility, and then as a full partner who carried his own weight and more than his share of the difficult work. He was a better swimmer than any of us, and the fastest paddler I have ever seen, capable of managing a loaded pirogue through difficult channel configurations that made the rest of us work hard and look slow. He had patience for the kind of repetitive, detailed work that loses men of otherwise good character as the season wears on. Checking mechanisms in the cold before dawn, resetting lines in the rain, maintaining equipment through the kind of routine maintenance that seems unimportant, until it saves a trap, that saves a pelt, that saves a season's margin. He was also the member of our crew most connected to the Creole traditions we had grown up in. Our mother had been born south of Breaux Bridge, and she had raised us with the old stories, the old names for things, the understanding that the basin was a place with its own rules, that had been in place long before anyone we knew was born. I had set most of that aside as I got older. It seemed to me as a working man that the basin's rules were practical ones, and that the old stories were how people without scientific language explained practical phenomena. Émile had not set it aside the same way. He took certain things seriously that I did not, and he maintained a respect for the old knowledge that I had come to associate with my mother, rather than with the basin itself. I say this not to diminish him. He was a serious and capable man in every respect. I say it because it is accurate, and because it is part of why he came to me before we left with a concern, and I did not give it the weight it deserved. because the Commission has asked me about them twice already, and I want to address them fully while I have the floor. In the weeks before the November trip, I had spoken informally with 2 trappers from the Maringouin area about the South Oxbow territory I was planning to work. I will not name them here unless the Commission requires it. Both men had been working the basin for longer than I had, and I respected their knowledge of the water, which is why I raised the question. I asked them why the South Oxbow had been left unworked. Given the quality of the habitat I had surveyed, I expected the answer to be some combination of access difficulty and prior season bad luck. The normal reasons an experienced trapper leaves a good line alone. The first man looked at me for a moment and then said, "The Rougarou." That was the entire answer. He did not elaborate. He picked up his coffee and he looked somewhere else. The second man gave me slightly more. He said the South Oxbow had been Rougarou country since before his father's time, meaning since the 1870s or earlier. He said the men who had tried to work it had come back wrong, meaning changed, meaning not the same as when they had left. He said one crew in the 1890s had not come back at all, and that the search party had found the camp intact and the men gone. Which is a piece of information I did not think about again until November 18th, when I was standing in my own intact camp without my crew. Neither man laughed. That is what Emile pointed out to me the night before we left. Neither of them had smiled or shown any discomfort at being asked about something they considered superstition, because they did not consider it superstition. They said it the way they would have said there is a strong current on the North Fork in spring, or you need to pull your traps before the October floods come in, as a fact of the basin that an experienced man should know and account for. I thanked them both, and told my crew the next morning that we were leaving on schedule. And when Emile asked me that evening whether I had noticed that neither man had laughed, I told him I had been doing this for 30 years, and I trusted my survey over a story I could not verify, and we were leaving in the morning. He went to bed without answering me. This was not unusual for Emile. He was not a man who argued after a decision was made. But I have thought about that moment many times since, specifically about what it would have cost me to say, "You are right, and we will find another line." What it would have cost in money and time and professional inconvenience, against what it actually cost. And the calculation is not a comfortable one to live with. November 11th had been Armistice Day, the news coming in on the morning that the war in Europe was over. There were bells and there were people in the streets, and there were men in the parish who wept openly, and men who had lost sons and were not sure how to feel. And the armistice news moved differently across their faces than across the faces of men who had not been there. I gave everyone the choice to stay in Maringouin one more day if they needed it. All 4 said we should go. The season was already behind, and we could not afford more delay. We loaded 2 pirogues at the landing south of town. I will inventory the load because it is relevant to what the Commission will find recorded in the supply manifest. 42 days of provisions for 5 men, 120 steel jaw traps of 3 different gauges, chain and post materials for anchoring, 2 hatchets, a camp saw, 5 bedrolls and 4 tents, 2 rifles and ammunition, a medical kit, rope and tarpaulin, cooking equipment, and the tools for trap maintenance and repair. We were outfitted for a full season, and our provisions were adequate for twice the time we ended up spending at that camp. The supply table in the intact camp was fully stocked when the sheriff's party arrived. Everything was there except the men. The trip from Maringouin to the South Oxbow campsite took the better part of a day's paddling, working down through the lateral channel system and into the Atchafalaya flow before turning west into the bayou network that feeds the Oxbow system. It was a route I had scouted twice during my survey work, and I knew it well enough to manage it without the notes I had made. The weather was clear and cold, which is good working weather in the basin. The cold keeps the insects down, and the water temperatures that stimulate mink activity had already arrived. By mid-afternoon, we were on the main oxbow run, and by late afternoon, we had the camp established on the raised ground at the inner bend. I want to describe that campsite in some detail, because the Commission's questions have suggested some uncertainty about its layout, and I want the physical situation to be clear. The raised ground at the inner oxbow bend was approximately 40 yards across at its widest point, and perhaps 15 yards deep, a slight elevation above the waterline that provided dry footing and a defendable camp position in the event of minor flooding. The oxbow channel ran along the south and east sides of the site, at a distance of roughly 20 yards from where we placed the tents. The north and west sides of the site were bordered by the Cypress Ridge, a stand of old-growth bald cypress whose root systems extended into the camp margin and whose canopy was dense enough to break the wind substantially. It was a good campsite by any professional standard. Solid footing, water access on two sides, wind protection on two sides, good sight lines across the water. We placed the 4 sleeping tents in a rough square arrangement with the supply area in the center between them, and the fire pit at the heart of the configuration. This is the standard arrangement we used on all extended trips. The supply area in the center protected by the tents on the perimeter, the fire maintained at the center as a shared resource, and a light source. The pirogues were pulled up on the south bank approximately 20 yards south of the tent perimeter and tied to 2 cypress roots that were solid enough to hold them. Both pirogues were secured independently with separate ropes. We spent the remainder of the night on the 12th, setting up the camp properly and reviewing the plan for the first day's line work. I had sketched the trap placement during the spring survey, and we had discussed the division of the work in advance. Tomas and I would take the north channel, running a line up through the cypress stand toward the ridge line, and then working back east. Joseph and Raymond would work the south channel, and the western branch that connected to a secondary water system I thought would be productive. Emile would set the eastern line alone, running along the main oxbow bank from the campsite to the point where the oxbow rejoined the main channel flow to the south. He could manage the eastern line without a partner, because he was the fastest setter among us, and the configuration was relatively straightforward, following the bank in a single direction without the need to double back. That first evening was the most ordinary evening of the trip. We ate, we talked over the morning's plan. Raymond checked his equipment with the thoroughness I had come to expect from him. The night sounds of the basin were present and normal. The chorus of frogs in the near shallows. The wood ducks somewhere distant in the upper timber. The low, constant sound of slow water moving through the root systems in the way water moves through old cypress roots. A particular sound that I have heard every November of my adult working life, and that I associate with the feeling of being in the right place at the right time of year doing the work I know how to do. I was asleep within an hour of banking the fire, which is the normal pace of a first night in camp when the travel has been long and the setup work has been thorough. I woke in the dark to nothing. I want the Commission to understand what I mean when I say nothing, because the word is insufficient for what I am describing. The Atchafalaya system at night in November is a constant texture of sound. It is not loud sound, not the kind of sound that intrudes on thought or conversation, but it is present continuously, the way your own breathing is present, the way your heartbeat is present, in the background of your awareness but never absent. A man who has spent 30 Novembers sleeping in that basin stops registering those sounds individually, the same way he stops registering his own red heartbeat. What he registers, what wakes him from sleep, with the particular alertness that only specific stimuli produce, is when that background stops. Everything stopped simultaneously, not fading out the way sounds fade when you are falling asleep, and the auditory processing becomes less sensitive. Stopped. The frogs, the wood duck in the distance, the water in the roots, the wind in the upper cypress, all at once, in the same instant, with no transition, as if someone had reached into the world and covered every source of sound with their hand. I lay still in my bedroll and I listened to the silence, and I counted seconds. At approximately the 20-second mark, the sounds began to return. Gradually, the frogs first in the near channel, and then the more distant sounds reassembling themselves one by one. The way sounds return after a large predator has moved through, and the prey animals have waited long enough to be sure. Within a minute, the night was as it had been before. I did not wake anyone. I noted the event in my mind and I gave it the explanation that seemed most plausible, which was a large animal moving through the territory nearby. Possibly a black bear, possibly a large alligator working the shallows. Animals go quiet when large predators pass. It is a known behavior, and I had observed it in that basin and in others, on a dozen previous trips. I went back to sleep. I did not mention it at breakfast. There was nothing to mention. I had heard the normal consequence of a large animal's passage, and there was no useful information to convey to the crew from it. We ate. We divided the work. We went to our lines. The first full day of trapping was exactly what the survey had promised it would be. Tomas and I covered the North Channel in good time, reading the bank as we went and placing 21 traps in positions that Tomas assessed with his usual precision. The habitat was as good as I had estimated. The root systems were active. The waterline showed the kind of regular animal traffic that leaves marks on mud and bark, and the upper timber had the character of old, undisturbed growth that provides the overhead cover mink prefer. I was satisfied. The North Line was going to produce. Joseph and Raymond had a comparable experience on the south and western branches, placing 31 traps across the two channels in positions Joseph had assessed with his characteristic care, checking each one twice before moving to the next. When they came back to camp at dusk, Raymond said the south branch had looked even better than the western connection, and that if the overnight catches confirmed what the habitat suggested, we should consider extending the south line by another 50 yards in the following days. Emile returned from the eastern line at dusk as well, moving quickly despite the fading light, which was his way. He reported 14 traps placed across 300 yards of channel bank, with access to both the main oxbow and a secondary cut he had found that he thought would add value to the line if the primary positions proved productive. He said the positioning had been straightforward and the bank conditions were good. He said all of this without enthusiasm, which at the time I attributed to tiredness from the travel and the setup work, and which I now understand was something else. What he said at dinner was what I should have given more weight. He said it almost as an aside, not looking at me, but at the fire. While we were eating, he said the eastern line was very quiet. He meant not the quiet of undisturbed habitat, which is a particular kind of quiet that an experienced trapper learns to read as a positive sign, but a different quiet. He said the birds had been absent from the upper timber along the entire length of the eastern bank for the whole day. Not sparse, absent. In November, in old-growth cypress, you expect a consistent bird presence in the upper canopy. Woodpeckers, warblers in some numbers, the larger wading birds moving between water sources. Emile said there had been none of it, and then he said the squirrels were gone too. From 100 yards in either direction of the line, he had not seen a squirrel or heard one for the entire time he was working. I said the cold front that had moved through in the first week of November had pushed the birds south early, and the squirrels were probably denned against the cold. He said he had worked that same type of habitat in the same cold conditions many times, and that was not what a cold front bird absence looked like. I said we would see what the overnight catches showed and make our assessment from the numbers. He said fine, and went to his tent. Raymond spoke to me separately the following morning, before the others were up. He said he had been working the south line, which ran at some distance and roughly parallel to the eastern bank, and he had noticed the same silence from the eastern timber for most of the previous afternoon. Not just the absence of birds, but an absence of the small animal activity sounds that are normally present in active habitat. The movement in the leaf litter, the minor splashing of animals entering and leaving the water, the general low-level acoustic texture of a living ecosystem. He said the eastern side of the camp had been acoustically empty from mid-morning on. I told him we would watch the lines carefully and see whether the overnight catches reflected any difference between the east and the other wrong directions. I believe I said this in a tone that conveyed the end of the conversation, which was not the tone I should have used. The second night brought what I will now call the vibration, because that is the closest single word I have for it, though I want the Commission to understand how inadequate that word is for the experience. I had gone to sleep normally. I was not in a heightened state of alertness from the previous night's sound event, or from the conversation with Emile or Raymond, because I had processed those things and placed them in the category of things that bear watching rather than things that demand immediate action. I fell asleep quickly, as I usually do in the field. I woke at some point in the deep of the night to the silence again, the full cessation. And this time I was alert from the first second, because whatever part of the sleeping mind had flagged the previous night's silence had been running in the background while I slept, and it was ready. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then, in the place where the frog chorus should have resumed, in the place where the water sounds should have returned, something else began. I have been asked to describe this by every person who has heard my account. I will describe it again now, as precisely as I am capable of. It was not a sound, or not primarily a sound. It was a pressure, a resonance in the chest, in the sternum, felt before heard. The way you feel a very large mill engine or a very large bell before your ears have time to register the acoustic component of what is happening. The sensation of something massive vibrating at a very low frequency. Except it was not a mill, and it was not a bell, and there was nothing mechanical within many miles of that camp. I sat up in my bedroll and I tried to locate the direction of the source. It seemed to come from the north, from the cypress ridge, which was the least accessible side of the camp, the side with the densest timber and the most broken ground. It was sustained, not pulsing or varying in amplitude or frequency, simply present at a constant level, the way a sustained note is present on a held breath. And it continued for what I estimate was between 50 and 60 seconds before it stopped. When it stopped, the frogs came back. Gradually, the way they had come back the night before, not all at once but in sequence. And the night reassembled itself, and I lay in the dark for a long time afterward with my eyes open, listening to the restored, ordinary sounds and thinking about what I had felt in my chest for 60 seconds. I had several explanations available to me. Channel current behavior at low temperature produces sounds that are different from warm water current sounds, and I had not worked that particular stretch of the oxbow before, and could not rule out a hydraulic phenomenon I had not encountered. Gas venting from the organic substrate of a cypress swamp produces sounds and physical effects that are sometimes startling if you have not experienced them in a particular form before, and again, this was new territory. And there were animals in the Atchafalaya system that I had not personally studied in depth. Some species of large catfish are known to produce low-frequency vibrations through their swim bladders during mating activity. And while November is not mating season for the species I knew, I was prepared to be wrong about the specifics of an animal's behavior. I settled on channel current as the most plausible explanation, and I went back to sleep. In the morning, Raymond told me that he had heard it. He came to me before breakfast, before the others were awake, and he described what he had felt in almost exactly my own terms. Not a sound, but a pressure, in the chest, like something very large at low frequency. He said it had come from the north, and it had lasted a long time. He said he had been awake for more than an hour afterward, trying to identify the source, and he had not been able to. I asked him which direction he was most confident about. He said north without hesitation. He said he had tracked it carefully, and the source was consistent throughout, north of camp, from the direction of the Cypress Ridge. I said we would check the lines. What we found on the eastern line that morning is what the Commission has the bent trap in evidence for, and I want to describe the full picture because the trap alone does not convey everything we found. The north and south and western lines had produced well, 22 catches between them, which was better than a typical second night, and which told us the habitat was as productive as the survey had suggested. I was looking at a strong season, or what would have been a strong season. The eastern line was different in ways that began before we found the damaged trap. Of the 14 traps Emile had set on the eastern line, 11 had been sprung. 11 of 14 traps triggered overnight. In itself, that is not unusual. A productive night on a good line can produce that kind of trigger rate, and animals that are not caught still spring traps in the course of their regular movement. But only 2 of the 11 had catches. 9 had been triggered with nothing in them, and the mechanism on each of those 9 had a specific characteristic that I need to describe carefully. A properly triggered steel jaw trap is triggered from above. An animal steps on the pan. The pan depresses under the animal's weight. The spring releases and the jaws close. The deformation of the pan is therefore consistent, pressed downward in the center, where the weight was applied. In 9 of the 11 sprung traps on the eastern line, the pan deformation was lateral or upward, indicating that the mechanism had been triggered from the side or from below, not from above. Something had interfered with the trap mechanism without stepping on it from the top. I examined 5 of them on my hands and knees in the bank mud, and I am confident in this assessment because reading a trap mechanism is something I have been doing for 30 years, and the evidence was unambiguous. Then there was the last trap. The last trap on the eastern line was positioned at the point where the channel bank dropped off into the main oxbow, in approximately 18 inches of water at the bank's edge. Emile had anchored it to a cypress knee, using the standard chain and post method, a steel post driven into the root structure of the cypress knee and a chain connecting the post to the trap's anchor ring. This is the method we use for bank edge positions on all of our lines. The post was solid when Emile set it. When we arrived at that position, the trap was not there. The post was there, snapped clean at the waterline, the metal sheared rather than bent, as if cut. The trap was in the shallows 20 feet to the north, lying in perhaps 3 inches of water, the chain lying slack beside it, and the trap's jaws were open. I need to be precise about what I mean. The jaws of a steel jaw trap are held closed by the tension of the spring mechanism. To open a closed trap, you either release the mechanism through the appropriate trigger point, which produces the normal opening action, or you apply external force to the jaws directly. The jaws on that trap had been forced open. Both jaws had been forced outward from the center, the steel deformed at the hinge points, bent away from center at roughly equal angles, as if something had seized both jaws simultaneously from the inside and pushed outward with sufficient force to overcome the spring tension and bend the steel. I have been asked whether a black bear could have done this. A black bear's jaw strength is considerable, but a bear attacks a closed trap from the outside, attempting to pry it open from the exterior with its teeth or paws. The damage to that trap was consistent with force applied from the interior, not the exterior. The bend geometry was outward from the center, not inward from the outside. Whatever had opened those jaws had done so from the inside, had placed something inside the closed mechanism and forced the jaws apart against the spring. I held that trap in my hands for some time. I am an experienced man with steel jaw mechanisms of multiple types, and I understand their construction and their limits. What I was holding had been done by something capable of exerting force sufficient to deform heavy-gauge steel, and it had done it from the inside of the mechanism, and it had done it quickly enough that the trap was simply gone from its position, rather than showing the signs of a prolonged struggle with the equipment. Emile took the trap from me and carried it back to camp without a word. He set it on the supply table. None of us touched it again during the trip. That afternoon, I convened the crew around the supply table, and I told them what I had found. I described the 9 backward-triggered mechanisms and the deformed artifact in front of them, and I put the trap on the table between us and let them look at it. Joseph made the case for a bear. He was not dismissive about it. He engaged with the evidence seriously and tried to build a scenario in which a panicked black bear, in sufficient distress, might generate the kind of force that had been applied to that trap. He acknowledged the geometric problem, the inside-out nature of the deformation, and he said that he could not fully account for it, but that a bear was the most plausible large animal in the region, with the strength to damage steel equipment. I did not dismiss him. He was applying the same kind of reasoning I had applied to the vibration the previous night. Find the most plausible, mundane explanation and hold it until the evidence requires you to revise it. Raymond said he thought we should pull the eastern line and not set it again. He said this simply and without elaboration, as a recommendation, not an argument. Thomas said the western line had been untouched and productive, and we should put our effort there, and not spend time on the east. Emile said we should leave. He said it at the same volume he said everything, which was slightly below the volume a man uses when he wants to be heard in a group. He said we should pull all 4 lines, load the pirogues, and return to Maringouin. He said the birds had been absent from the eastern timber for 2 full days, which in his experience indicated that the ecosystem on that side of the camp had been displaced by something the birds considered dangerous enough to abandon suitable habitat over. He said the traps on the eastern line had been visited by something with the physical capability to bend steel, and that no animal he was familiar with had that capability in the specific form the damage showed. And he said something had been present in the north timber the previous night, making a sound that none of us could identify, and that 3 things of that kind taken together were not a coincidence he was willing to attribute to bad luck and proceed. He said all of this calmly and clearly. He was not afraid in the way a man is afraid when he cannot think. He was afraid in the way a man is afraid when he can think very clearly, and what his thinking is producing is a strong recommendation to leave. The argument that followed divided our crew in a way I had not experienced with these men in 6 years of working together. Raymond and Emile were clear. They wanted to leave, and they wanted to leave the following morning at the latest. Raymond raised the practical point that leaving in the dark was not advisable on that channel network, and he thought the earliest safe departure was first light, which he could accept if we agreed to go then. Emile accepted that condition. Joseph and Thomas wanted to stay. Joseph's argument was financial and honest. We had invested significantly in the season, and the 3 working lines were producing above expectation, and the eastern line's problems might have a mundane explanation we had not correctly identified yet. And abandoning the season at this point would produce a loss that would be difficult for him to absorb. Thomas's argument was more about professional judgment. He believed we were letting unfamiliar sounds in unfamiliar territory create anxiety that was distorting our assessment of a manageable situation, and he was not willing to let that happen. I had the deciding position. I want the Commission to understand that clearly. The decision was mine, and I have no interest in distributing the responsibility elsewhere. I said, we will close the eastern line. We will pull those 14 traps and leave the eastern bank unset for the remainder of the trip. We will continue working the north, south, and western lines for 3 more days, and then reassess. If anything further happens, anything at all that we cannot explain to our professional satisfaction, we will leave the following morning without discussion or debate. I set that condition clearly. I said if anything further happens, we go, and there will be no argument about it. Raymond asked me what I meant by anything further. I told him I thought it would be clear when we encountered it. He looked at me for a moment, and he looked at the bent trap on the table, and he did not say anything else. Emile also said nothing. He accepted the decision the way he always accepted my decisions, without further argument, which I had always taken as a sign of his respect for my judgment, and which I now understand was also a form of trust that I did not deserve to have. The 3rd night in camp was when the sound changed. I had gone to sleep early, which tells you something about my confidence in the decision I had made. A man who is genuinely troubled by his situation does not sleep easily. I fell asleep quickly and slept deeply, and when I woke it was to the silence again, the complete and simultaneous cessation. And this time the silence was so sudden and so complete that it brought me upright in my bedroll before I was fully conscious of being awake. I sat and I listened. The silence held, and then the vibration began. It was lower in register than the previous nights. I mean by this that it occupied a deeper frequency, a longer wavelength, something that I felt not only in my sternum but in the back of my teeth and in the bones of my jaw, and in the inner ear, at a level below what is normally audible. The closest comparison I have is the sensation of being too near a large artillery piece when it fires. That shock through the body that arrives before the sound reaches the ears. Except there was no sound following it, no explosion, just the sustained pressure that continued at this new lower register and did not vary. It was coming from two directions: the north, which was where it had been before, from the Cypress Ridge, and the east, from the channel bank where we had found the damaged trap, from the direction of the water. Two separate sources at the same frequency, running simultaneously, as if whatever had been on the north side had divided itself, or called something to the east side, or as if there had been two of them all along, and the previous night had been only the one, and they were closer. This is the part that I have the most difficulty conveying accurately, because distance estimation, based on a non-acoustic sensation, is not something I had ever been required to do before. But I had 2 nights of experience with that vibration, at what I judged to be a certain distance, and what I was feeling on the 3rd night was measurably more intense, which in my understanding of how pressure propagates through space and air meant the sources were measurably closer to where I was sitting. I sat up for perhaps 2 hours after the vibration stopped. I did not get out of my tent. I listened to the frogs, which had come back only from the south and west sides of the camp, and I noted that the north and east sides remained without frog sound, which meant either the frogs had not returned to those sides, or there was something on those sides that the frogs were avoiding. At first light, I was the first one at the fire, and I could see from the faces of the men who came out of their tents that I was not the only one who had had a difficult night. Raymond had the look of a man who had not slept. Emile was watchful in a way that went beyond his normal morning alertness. Thomas and Joseph looked as if they had slept adequately, and I was unsure whether this was because they had genuinely slept through what the rest of us had heard or because they were managing their presentation of themselves to the group. At breakfast, I told the crew what I had heard. 2 sources, closer than before, from the north and east simultaneously. I put the information in front of them, and I did not speculate about the source, and I did not use any particular word for what I thought was producing it. Raymond said he had tracked it from 2 directions, and he agreed with my assessment. He said the eastern source had been approximately 30 to 40 yards from the camp margin, which in his estimation was the closest a wild animal could have been to our position without being visible at the edge of the firelight. Emile said he had heard it from the east, and that it had lasted longer than the previous nights. He said approximately 2.5 minutes. Thomas said he had heard something but could not confirm the direction or duration. Joseph said nothing for a long time, and then said he thought we should check the lines and come back and make a decision. I said we would. The 4th day was when the animals began to leave in a way that could no longer be attributed to cold front behavior or normal territory variation. The birds were gone from the upper timber, all of them, all species, from all sides of the camp except the south channel side. Raymond pointed this out over the breakfast fire, and I acknowledged it without offering an explanation. By the time Thomas and I had reached the midpoint of the north channel line, working the traps we had set 2 days earlier, the squirrels were absent from the ridge timber. This was not the absence of animals that have simply moved to a different part of their range. The ridge was excellent squirrel habitat in excellent squirrel weather, and the sign of their presence had been consistent for the first 2 days. They were gone, as if they had received a signal, and departed. By midday, the water itself had gone quiet. I was resetting a trap on the north line when I noticed that the ambient water sounds had dropped to almost nothing. Not the absence of current, which does not change with animal behavior, but the absence of the small splashes and surface disturbances that indicate active life. Fish rising, turtles submerging, the constant minor activity of the things that live in and around the water of an active basin. It was not there anymore. I found Thomas looking at the water from the bank with an expression I had not seen on his face before. He saw me looking at him and he said, "Where are the fish?" Not an accusation, a genuine question. The flat, still surface of a water that should have been alive with November activity, gone quiet as a sealed container. We came back to camp for midday, and I was resupplying my trap bag when Raymond arrived from the south line. He walked into camp and he set down his bag and he looked at me and he said, "Alcide, everything is leaving." He said it the way a man says a thing that he has been holding back because he thought there was still some other explanation available, and he has now concluded that there is not. I told him I was aware of it. He said he had been in that basin since he was 17 years old, and he had never seen a displacement of all species simultaneously from a suitable habitat in suitable weather conditions, without a chemical event or a catastrophic flood, and neither of those things was happening here. I said he was correct. He said he thought we needed to leave that day. I told him we would finish the afternoon's run, come back, and I would make a decision. I need to tell the commission about what happened to me at the end of the South Line that afternoon, in the fading light, because it is the moment when I stopped having plausible alternative explanations available to me and started understanding that the decision I had made 3 days earlier had been wrong. I was at the far southern end of the South Line, the last 2 traps before the line turned back north toward camp. The light was going fast. It goes fast in the Atchafalaya in November, the long shadows of the cypress arriving an hour before actual dark, and I was moving quickly because I did not want to be at the far end of the line in diminished light. I was crouched over the second-to-last trap, checking the mechanism, when I heard something from the eastern bank. The eastern bank of the South Channel at that point was perhaps 15 to 18 yards away, separated from me by the water. The trees on that bank were in deep shadow already, the canopy thick enough to have reduced the light under it to something that was more like dark than like dusk. What I heard was breathing. It was not a small animal in the underbrush. It was not the respiratory sound of any animal in the size range that is common to that water system. What I heard was slow and deep and deliberate, the inhalation-hold-exhalation pattern of something with a chest cavity large enough to require a long breath to fill and a long breath to empty. The cadence was not rapid the way a frightened or active animal breathes. It was slow and regular, the breathing of something at rest or of something that does not need to breathe quickly because it is not exerting itself. And it was coming from above the waterline on the eastern bank, not from the water, not from the ground, from somewhere in the lower branches or against the trunk at a height that placed the source 8 to 12 feet above the ground. I held very still. The breathing continued without interruption. It did not change when I stopped moving. It did not quicken or pause the way a startled animal's breathing changes when it becomes aware of a human presence. It simply continued at the same pace, as if I were not there, or as if my presence was not relevant to whatever was doing the breathing. I stood up slowly. I turned toward the sound. The eastern bank was dark and I could see nothing in the trees. No shape, no movement. No reflection of the remaining skylight off any surface that would have indicated an animal's eye or skin. Nothing visible. The breathing continued. I picked up my trap bag and I walked back to camp. The commission should know. I walked. Not because I was not afraid, because I understood that running would commit my legs to a direction without input from my head, and my head wanted to stay between me and the camp, not get ahead of me where it could not see what was behind me. That night, I told the crew what I had heard. The effect on the group was different from any previous discussion we had had on that trip. Raymond said immediately, before I had finished describing the location, that he had been hearing the same sound for 2 nights. On the north side of his tent, from the direction of the cypress ridge, during the pre-dawn hours when everything else was silent. He had not said anything because he could not identify it, and he did not want to say he heard something breathing if he was not certain what he was hearing. But what I had described on the south line was exactly what he had been hearing from the north side of camp at night. Emile said he had heard it once, on the second night, and had thought it was a large alligator working its way along the north bank. He said he had revised that assessment the following morning, when he found no alligator sign on the north bank. Joseph said he had heard something on the second night from the direction of the western trees, and had attributed it to a large animal in the undergrowth. Thomas said he had not heard anything he would describe in those terms. But he also said it with a careful quality that made me think he was choosing his words rather than simply reporting a negative. I looked at all four of them, and I thought about 30 years of field judgment, and what that judgment was producing when I applied it to the brays. Accumulated evidence of 4 days, the complete cessation of sound that preceded the vibration each night, the vibration itself from multiple directions, the displaced wildlife, the 9 backward-triggered traps, the deformed steel artifact on the supply table, and now the breathing from above the waterline on 2 separate sides of the camp on multiple nights. And I made the decision I had committed to making if anything further happened. I told them we were leaving at first light, not in the morning after another day's run. At first light the following morning. We would take no more watches except a paired watch through the night, so that someone was always awake and aware of the camp's perimeter. At first light we would load both pirogues with as much of the equipment as we could carry in one trip, and go north up the channel to the main bayou road. I said this was not a discussion. Emile said fine. The first time in 4 days that a decision I had made had produced that response from him. Raymond said fine. Joseph said he understood, and he wanted it in the record of this crew's discussions that leaving at this point would represent a significant financial loss that the season's catches could not offset, and that he was accepting the decision but reserving his professional disagreement with the circumstances that had produced it. I told him his position was noted. Thomas said he would follow whatever decision I made, and he had always said he would. But he wanted me to know that in his view, we were making a decision under the influence of fear rather than evidence, and that he did not think fear was an adequate basis for professional decisions. I told him I understood his view. I did not tell him that I thought he was wrong. I thought he was wrong. I set the watch order. Thomas and Joseph would take the first watch from 9 until midnight. Emile and Raymond would take the second watch from midnight until 3. I would take the pre-dawn watch from 3 until light, and during that watch, I would also begin organizing the supply area and separating what we could carry from what we would have to leave, so that when the others rose, we could be on the water in 30 minutes. I went to my tent at 9 o'clock. I was asleep in minutes. He and Raymond were both dressed and both awake when I came to them. Neither of them had the look of men who had slept at any point during their watch. Emile said the vibration had started during their watch, sometime around 1 in the morning, and that it had been different from previous nights in 2 specific ways. It was the closest it had been since the first night, and it had moved. He said he and Raymond had sat back to back at the fire's edge and tracked it by the pressure in their chests, turning their bodies until the resonance seemed to equalize on both sides, which is the method you use to locate a directional sound source. He said the vibration had been on the north side first, and then it had shifted east, and then it had moved south along the eastern bank, and then it had crossed the south end of the camp, past the area where the pirogues were beached, and come north on the west side, around the perimeter, not randomly, systematically, as if mapping the camp's dimensions at a consistent distance from the fire. And when it had completed the circuit and come back to the north and west sides, the south and east sides had gone quiet. I told them to get some rest, and I took my watch position at the edge of the firelight. For the first half hour, nothing happened. The camp was quiet. The surrounding swamp was quiet. No frogs, no birds, no water sound, nothing from any direction. The kind of silence that by the 4th night had become its own form of warning. I fed the fire to maintain the light, and I stood where I could put my back to the fire and see outward in all directions through the dark. though in practice the firelight only carried 20 or 25 feet before the darkness swallowed it. Beyond that margin, I was listening, not looking. The vibration began at approximately 3:30 in the morning. I will tell the Commission directly what I experienced, because this is the part that I have the most difficulty describing and the most obligation to try. The vibration was on 3 sides, north, east, and west, simultaneously. 3 separate resonances at the same frequency, each holding a fixed position, each at a level that told me the sources were close, closer than any previous night, perhaps 30 yards out at the nearest, perhaps less, and all 3 were sustained at the same level, not pulsing, not varying, as if 3 things had taken up positions around the camp and were simply present at those positions, holding them, making that sound in the dark. I stood at the edge of the firelight, and I did not move. I tracked all 3 sources by turning slowly and feeling where the resonance was strongest. North, east, west. 3 points of a partial triangle, with the southern and eastern sides of the camp open, the water side open, the pirogue side open. Then the eastern source moved. I felt it shift. The resonance from the east moved south, following the channel bank, moving past the pirogue position on the south bank, continuing west along the far side of the channel, and then settling into a new position on the northwest. And all 3 sources were now on the north and west arc of the camp. The south and east sides were open. The south bank with the pirogues was unobstructed. The south bank with both pirogues. The Commission has asked me whether I believe what I experienced next was an interpretation or an instinct. I will answer that I do not know how to distinguish between those 2 things in the moment when they occur. What I know is that my body understood something about the situation before my mind had finished processing the information, and that what my body understood was that the open side was deliberate, and that the water was available, and that the longer I stood at the fire's edge, the less available it might become. I do not know if that understanding was correct. I may never know. What I did was this. I walked to the south bank. I picked up the rope on the nearest pirogue. I untied it from the cypress root. I pushed the pirogue to the water's edge, and I got in, and I pushed off into the south channel. I was on the water before I had made a conscious decision to be on the water. I was 20 yards down the channel before I understood that I had left the other pirogue on the bank. I was perhaps 50 yards from camp, moving south in the dark, when the full weight of what I had done arrived. I was moving away from the camp. My brother was in a tent 20 yards from the bank. 3 other men who trusted my judgment were in tents 20 yards from the bank. There was another pirogue on the bank, tied to its root, capable of carrying all 4 of them to safety. And I had not woken any of them. I did not go back. The Commission should know that I have examined this decision, or this failure to decide, from every angle available to me in the month since November, and I have not found an angle from which it looks acceptable. I have found angles from which I understand it, which is not the same thing. I was afraid in a way I had not previously been afraid in my working life. I was on the water with movement under me. The vibration on the 3 sides of the camp had stopped the moment I pushed off, or stopped shortly after. The night was quiet around me. Everything that told me to keep moving was very loud, and everything that told me to go back was, in that moment, very quiet. I paddled south for nearly 2 hours without stopping. I navigated by memory and by starlight through the gaps in the canopy, picking up the secondary channel connections I had scouted in the spring and following them back to the main bayou road in the dark. It is a measure of how frightened I was that I navigated that route in the dark without error, because the conditions should have required me to stop and wait for light. I did not stop. I reached the main bayou road at approximately 5:30 in the morning. A supply truck from a farm operation south of Grosse Tete was moving north on the road, and I flagged it down. I told the driver 4 men were missing from a trapping camp to the south, and I needed to reach the authorities immediately. He drove me to Grosse Tete, I told the deputy there what I am telling this commission. By 11 in the morning, we had a party of 6 men, including the sheriff and 2 of his deputies, going back into the basin on borrowed pirogues and a flat-bottomed john boat. We arrived at the camp at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The camp was intact. That is the only word for it. The 4 tents were standing. The fire had burned to coals but had not gone out entirely. The supply table was as I had left it, with the bent trap in the center. 2 bedrolls had been disturbed, blankets and clothing pulled back as if their occupants had risen and dressed quickly. 2 bedrolls were still folded as if unused. A coffee pot sat where it had been left the previous evening. The provisions were undisturbed. The second pirogue was on the south bank, still tied to its cypress root. I cannot describe what it was to look at that pirogue on the bank. The commission can form its own understanding of what it meant that all 4 men, experienced working men who knew that water and knew how to move on it at night, had not used the pirogue that was available to them. We called across the water and into the timber until the echo of our calling was the only sound returning. We checked the immediate bank for tracks and found nothing the sheriff's men could attribute to any identifiable source. We took the canoes and the john boat out onto the oxbow and called from the water. Nothing. 3 days of searching produced nothing. The dogs brought in on the 3rd day produced nothing. No track, no clothing, no sign of any kind of what had happened to 4 experienced men in a well-supplied camp 8 hours after I had left them sleeping. I want to tell the commission one thing that is not in the prior accounts I have given, because it was not something I had processed clearly enough in the earlier conversations to state it properly. When I arrived at the camp with the sheriff's party that afternoon, I walked directly to the supply table before I did anything else. The bent trap was there, exactly as we had left it. I picked it up, and I held it, and I looked at those outward forced jaws, the deformed steel, the geometry of something that had been inside and had pushed its way out. I thought about the South Channel at 3:30 in the morning, and the open side, and the pirogue. I thought about Emile saying, before we left Maringouin, that neither of those men had laughed. I set the trap back on the table, and I went to help the sheriff's men with the search. The commission has asked whether I believe the Rougarou was responsible for the disappearance of the 4 men. I will answer that question clearly, and I will not revisit it. I do not use that word. I am not capable of using that word in a sworn statement because I cannot demonstrate that the thing which was in the cypress swamp around that camp was the creature by that name, rather than something else that no one has named. What I can tell the commission with certainty is that it was not a bear, and it was not any other animal in my working knowledge of that water system, and it was not a human being or group of human beings, and it was not a mechanical phenomenon or a geological one, and it was capable of deforming heavy-gauge steel from the inside and of producing a chest-level resonance from multiple fixed positions simultaneously. And it had enough familiarity with human camp configurations to arrange itself around the 3 landward sides of a camp and leave the waterward side, the boat side, open. What it was, I cannot say. What it did, I have said. And the bent trap is in this room as the only physical corroboration of what I have told you. My brother Emile had told me, before we ever left Maringouin, that we should not go to that place. He told me with the calm clarity of a man who has learned to take certain knowledge seriously, and I told him it was superstition, and he came anyway because he trusted my judgment the way a man trusts the judgment of someone who has never given him a reason to doubt it. I gave him a reason in the dark of November 18th. I gave him every reason, and it was too late for it to matter. I do not sleep cleanly anymore. The vibration comes back at night sometimes, in the hours before dawn, not from any direction I can locate, simply present the way it was present in that camp. That low chest resonance, the pressure below sound, and I lie still, and I wait for it to pass. It always passes when morning comes. I have told myself that means it is something my mind produces, a consequence of what I carry, rather than an external phenomenon. I have not fully convinced myself of this. Some nights I am not sure the distinction matters. I have said what I have to say. I am available for this commission's questions. I will answer them as directly and as accurately as I am able. I am sorry that I cannot answer the most important question, which is what happened to those 4 men in the hours between 3:30 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. I am sorry that the most important question is also the one I am least equipped to answer, and that the reason I am least equipped to answer it is the decision I made at 3:30, when I took the rope off the first pirogue, and did not take the rope off the second one. That is all.